Welcome to the Form Book Club. You're missing the wonderful discussion we had before we go on the air. Maybe sometime we'll show that to you. But now we're on the air, and we are going to begin discussing this book by Nicolas Diat, A Time to Die, which is his interview of monks on the threshold of eternal life. And Nicolas Diat was a very close friend of Cardinal Sarah, and was also the interlocutor with Cardinal Sarah on the books we've done by Cardinal Sarah, has written a book, and of course his friend has written the, what is it called, a foreword or preface, introduction, foreword to it. But we are broadcasting this or doing this session at a time when the coronavirus is on everybody's mind, and people have been thinking about death. In fact, they're wearing masks to try and prevent them causing death to others or bringing it on themselves. And it's amazing that around the globe, there's been a lot more thought about death than we've had previous to that, and our society which kind of puts death aside. And here, Nicolas Diat has visited 8 monasteries in France to talk to the abbots and the other monks about their attitude toward death and some of the deaths they've experienced in the monastery and what that can teach us. It's a very illuminating book. And before we get into the beginning here, I want to say 2 things. One, that it's not a morbid book. It's about death and dying, but it's about hope. It's about what the proper attitude is toward death and how these men who have given their lives to God have faced death. With all their difficulties, they've got depression, they've got disease, as well as normal, healthy lives. And so they really are kind of a mirror of what we experience ourselves with respect to death. But I want to say also that about monasteries, surprised me in reading Newman's History of Benedictine Dedication, that in the year 1200, when Europe had a population of about 250 million, they think, which is less than the U.S. right now, there were 40,000 Benedictine monasteries in Europe. 40, not monks, monasteries. That would be like having about 1,000 monasteries in each state in the United States. Can you imagine that in your state, South Carolina, Joseph, with 1,000 monasteries? This is an amazing culture. But the heritage of that has come down to us, and especially in France, there's many, many wonderful monasteries. And the monks there have spent their time reflecting on God, the world, themselves, and life, and they're preparing themselves for death. So this is the book where we get the benefit of their prayer, their reflection. But I'm going to pass this on to you, Joseph, to kind of lead the discussion here, since you and Vivian are more literate than I am, and this is a book more narrative than it is principles.
Well, I'd like to start, you're completely correct, Father. This whole book serves in many ways as a memento mori, and which reminds us of the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. So it's a very perennial. It might be obviously very relevant to the coronavirus, but it's perennial in its relevance.
Are there still 4? I thought there's only 3 now. Death, judgment, and heaven.
Not in my book. At the end of the foreword, which, as you say, was written by Cardinal Sarah, he says something I think sets the scene very well. Death places us in the infinity and depths of God. In reading A Time to Die, we better understand that death is the most important act of earthly existence. All life is made to explode, to go farther, to merge with life itself, with God. So death is the most important act of earthly existence. Now, of course, and we live in a world that basically is in denial about death, that brushes death under the carpet like a cockroach and doesn't want to talk about it. And of course, the virus has prevented that from being the case. But I do think that this is a book is very, very, very good for all of us to be reading at all times, but perhaps especially now. And on that, maybe I'll pass on to Vivian to take things from there.
Well, the first chapter, A Life Cut Short, why don't we go there? And I would like to point out that each of these chapters has a beautiful opening piece of art. We hired a French artist who had recently become a Catholic to make the opening images of each of these monasteries, which I think does help draw you in to the atmosphere of these places of prayer and beauty. And anyway, the first chapter, A Life Cut Short, it's titled that because the person who dies that's focused on in this chapter is a youngish man who dies of a slow degenerative illness, a muscular neurological disease, progressive disease.
Multiple sclerosis, I think was it. Let's pause, Vivian, because a lot of people don't, have a good idea of where things are in France, although I had the blessing of being there for 3 years, and so I do. But Thomas, our technical support here, can you show us the Google map, which will show where this monastery is? There it is. Can you see that, Joseph and Vivian? No, you can't see it.
I cannot.
Ah, well, I can see it. You want to expand that a bit? Okay. So it's in kind of south of France, but sort of central to France. And that's where Lagrasse Abbey is. And do you have a photo for us, Thomas, of Lagrasse? That's coming up soon. Oops, we're getting closer and closer to Lagrasse. It's a beautiful place, as so many places are in France. Wow, we're zooming in, and there it is. There is Lagrasse Abbey. And there is a photo of it, very beautiful in the French countryside there.
What's the closest large city?
Ooh, it's near Carcassonne.
Okay.
That's not that large, but...
So this abbey is famous for another thing. I hate to cause a digression, but I don't know if you remember, there was a while ago, a young French officer exchanged himself for a hostage in a terrorist incident outside Carcassonne. Do you remember this story?
Yes, I do.
That French officer was receiving instruction in the Catholic faith at this monastery. And when the incident happened, I remember reading about it with such interest because that monastery was featured in this book. Anyway, that's just an aside.
So now we've seen what it is on the map. We've seen some lovely pictures of it. I'm sorry that Joseph and Vivian, you couldn't see those pictures, but if you want to watch this podcast or watch this YouTube thing after it's over, you can see the pictures. So go ahead, Vivian, about Brother Vincent Marie.
Right. And so it's interesting that the author chose to open this book with the death of a younger man. Some of the other stories that follow are of older monks, quite old. And, just that sober reminder that, not all of us live to a ripe old age, right? Our lives can be cut short by illness that we don't expect. And how this was such a shocker for the community too. And that was one of the very human sides to this book, is seeing that these men in the monastery, they have the same struggles we do, with dealing with illness themselves, dealing with the burden of caring for those who are sick, trying to find Christ in the sick, and showing that kind of love. It's a very moving book.
Yeah, I would say that if I may, two things. There's the two phrases in here which I think caused me to pause and maybe question. So in the right at the beginning on page 15, when Nicolas Diat says, "These men are not heroes. Their fears, their sorrows, their torments are very real." And I think that I would only query that in the sense that there's nothing heroic unless you have to overcome fear, unless you have to deal with sorrow and suffering and torment. That's what heroism is made of. That's the very fabric of heroism. So, and then further on page 28, another thing that I put a question mark in the margin. about 2/3 of the way down the page there. He did not surrender himself out of generosity, but out of love. And I'm thinking, well, surely love, by definition, the Christian understanding of it is generous. So there's those two things. But at his best, he's marvelous. So the bottom of page 29, when he's talking about the debilitating sickness of multiple sclerosis, which is killing this young monk, he says here towards the bottom of page 29, the final weeks were the breaking point. The corporeal shell was used up like a fabric that no longer has any fibers. One could still wear the clothing, but it was ripping everywhere. His flesh could no longer hold his soul. It was too damaged. His death was the liberation of a soul that had become a prisoner. You know, and again, we when we were talking about this some other time, we were saying that we have to be careful, right? Because talking about the soul as something separate from the body is dangerous and heretical. But I do think that, you know, if someone is physically or mentally damaged, so if it's somebody's mentally damaged, that their soul is not able to either receive the information it needs to fully love or to express that love. So in that sense, it is trapped in a shell, which is a prison. Of course, that doesn't prevent God from bringing the soul to himself and the body, which will presumably be the beatified body and not the disabled one.
Well, here's an example of that. We are recording this, with a video, and we hope it's going to work out. But we're communicating spiritually in the sense of intellectually, meaning of our words and so on. So there's an element there which can't be reduced to matter, which is intelligibility. But if it turns out that there's something wrong with this recording, or something wrong with the recorder, or the transmission, it can get garbled. Well, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with the intelligibility of what we say, but the material substrate, which has been necessary for us to transmit it, is defective in some way. So likewise, you think about people, well, I think about, your son Leo. Does Leo have a soul? Give an intelligence? And of course he does. But there's a physical, physiological problem there which prevents him from fully expressing himself. But so that it's true that the human soul is, in a sense, imprisoned in the body, but it's also liberated by the body, because we couldn't talk now if we weren't, creating sound waves and radio waves and so on that communicate to others.
And we know, of course, that our souls will be united with our glorified bodies, whatever that exactly that is, at the end. And forever thereafter. So we do believe that the soul and body are meant to be together, but obviously in paradise the defects won't be preventing the soul from operating at its fullest.
Yeah, I do.
In fact,
go ahead.
There's a beautiful line from Charles de Gaulle when his daughter, who I believe had Down syndrome, died, and as they were leaving the grave, he turned to his wife and said, "Now she's like the others," and meaning that now she had the fullness that was missing in this life. He adored that daughter, and there was a very tender love in the family. So he didn't mean it. He didn't mean that expression in any way other than to say that now whatever was holding her back in this life was no longer impeding her, right? So I like to think of the body as being the means by which our souls can express themselves in this world.
That's exactly
right. And to the degree that those bodies are infirm or weakened in some way or defective in some way or whatever it is, those are the things that will be healed in heaven, so that our souls will have their even greater expression, which is something for all of us to look forward to.
It is. And also, one of my quibbles with Thomas Aquinas, who of course is more brilliant than all of us put together, and a lot of other people put together, is that because Jesus died at age 33 approximately, Thomas's idea was when our bodies are resurrected, they'll be at the state they were at age 33.
Oh.
To which I say, look, I've been there, and I'm looking for better than that, okay? But it will be
I was
like you
pretty
say,
good at
Vivian.
33. Actually, I'd set up a 33.
The spiritual
Father.
body, it's like the Eucharist. I mean, is that really the body of Christ? Yes, but it's present in San Francisco and in South Carolina and in Kenya and in Rome and at the same moment and throughout history. Well, no body can do that. So the resurrected body is something which eye is not seen, ear is not heard, nor has it entered into the mind of man. But for sure, it will, as you say, Vivian, it will remove all these hindrances to the full expression of our soul here.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps as we're about halfway through, if I can just conclude the discussion on chapter 1, so we can move on to chapter 2, with two marvelous metaphors that Nicolas Diat employs, one of sand and one of snow, to sort of encapsulate the death of this young brother from multiple sclerosis, this debilitating disease. So on page 35, the final page of the chapter, just about 10 lines down, the cannons were like children on a beach protecting a sandcastle. The sea rises and the beautiful construction is doomed. So the little ones take action with the naivete of young pirates and the energy of those who know they will lose the battle. The inevitable happens. The water rises to the heart of the castle and the walls of sand collapse in an instant without making a sound. So that's one metaphor. And then the final paragraph, well, actually it's the penultimate paragraph. Brother Vincent was a giant. His body melted like the snow in the spring sunshine, but his soul was lighter every day.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
That is beautiful, yeah.
That's beautiful. And that image of shoring up the sandcastle, that when someone is sick and you're in the position of taking care of that sick person, and they're deteriorating, that's exactly what it feels like you're doing. You know that the end is going to come, and you're doing what you can for this sick person.
So it's like, it's a losing battle, like trying to protect the sandcastle, but plucking out the words of Tolkien, it's a long defeat, which is itself glorious, right?
It is. And in the next chapter, if I may segue to the next chapter.
Well, before you get there, I want to say one thing about that, because it's kind of paradoxical. The energy of those who know they will lose the battle. Well, you'd think that might mean, well, they're not going to fight that hard. They're going to lose anyway, right? But no. I mean, even if you know you lose the battle, in one sense, I mean, you fight more vigorously. You're defending your homeland. You're defending everything which is valuable. As Chesterton said, it's not that you hate what's in front of you, except for the fact you love what's behind you, and you're not going to give in. It's like England during World War II. I mean, they should have given in. They should have surrendered, or at least had some kind of as was proposed, some kind of negotiations with Hitler. But God bless the English, they said, no way. We're not going to subject ourselves to that, even if we die. So, and as I've said often, we've not suffered very much at all, that, I don't care if I win the battle, I just want blood on my sword. Now, Vivian, go ahead.
Amen. Church militant.
Right. So this next chapter, they talk about, the author rather talks about this difficulty of making these medical decisions now that we have more and more technological interventions of medicine, trying to figure out when you need to stop, when you need to let go. These are not easy decisions to make, and it just never occurred to me that in a monastery they struggle with those decisions just as we do. When do you call the 911? When do you take that monk back to the hospital one more time, and so on? And to see that discussed in this book was eye-opening. And page 41 is an example of this, where the author is interviewing the abbot of a Benedictine monastery, and he says that the role of the father abbot was always to encourage the old monks to face the end of the road. Today, there is no longer any question of that. At the moment when life hangs by a thread, there is the emergency medical service, the firemen, And before the day of the final departure, there are many small departures in white cars or red vans, oxygen, transfusion, antibiotics. Then life resumes for a few weeks or a few short years. Why worry an elderly brother by speaking to him about the last things? When I visit a monk to tell him that heaven approaches, I have to be certain of his state of health. If not, the spiritual path no longer has meaning.
Yeah, further down that page is a question of great minds thinking alike here, Vivian, because I've actually got the next thing I want to talk about on the same page. And the conclusion to all of this, Dom David is towards the bottom of the page. Dom David does not trust a system where medicine alone gives meaning to life. Where is God in these complex mechanisms, he asks. He is afraid of this transfer from the divine to medical power. Now, I know we had a discussion. Father has talked to her, Father has had the benefit of specialists. And I know you have, Vivian. I've been very lucky so far. I don't know how long that will last. But obviously, we've all experienced. I had my life saved when I went into anaphylactic shock. So at one stage or other, we've all been the beneficiaries of medical science, and obviously all of us are grateful for that. But the problem is if that medical science becomes a substitute for God, that's the arbiter of truth and health.
Yes,
right.
I want to interject here. This is chapter 2, The Shadow of the Black Mountain. It's En-Calcat Abbey. And I want Thomas to show us on the map where that is. It's not too far from Lagrasse. It's in southern France. It's between Castres and Carcassonne. Carcassonne is that beautiful walled city, medieval walled city in France, which is, if you're ever there in southern France, you have to visit that place. It's really spectacular. But we're focusing in now and showing you the monastery itself. There it is. With a couple of pictures, Thomas, can you show us the actual? There it is. There's the facade of the monastery. Beautiful buildings. Right? Look at that chapel. I mean, that really is marvelous and prayerful. And if you go to France, which I encourage you to do, by all means visit these monasteries, at least some of them. You walk into those lovely chapels, Romanesque sometimes, Gothic sometimes. They're really places of prayer. So back to the chapter itself, I think that because of a general loss of faith in Western society, the life has become something more to cling to than to understand as a preparation for something even greater and more beautiful. And so we try to use all the means we can to protect people and make them live for as long as we possibly can, or at least keep their organs alive. I mentioned to you before my friend Art Quinn, who was a wonderful professor at University of California, Berkeley, of rhetoric, brilliant man. His father was dying. Kidney was not functioning. But the doctors were keeping his father alive to keep the kidney alive. And he said to the doctors, well, is my dad dying? Well, he's dying. He's going to die pretty soon. Well, who cares about his kidney then? But the specialists, you have to try and protect, what your specialist is. By the way, it's a problem during the coronavirus is that you want to get the advice of health officials. But what is their goal? Their goal is to prevent any disease, any deaths from disease. And so they're, by constitution, by their occupation, they're going to be the most careful of anyone, which is important. They should do that. But there are other factors too,
erring on the side of caution makes sense, but only within the context of a bigger picture. One thing, for instance, by the way, that really sums this up was, and I don't want to spend time criticizing the bishops, but an absolutely essential healthcare worker is a priest. To be there for the last rites, if someone's in danger of death, we want to see a priest. Now, we can say, well, if we can't see a priest, then it's not our fault. True. But those that were responsible for ensuring that we could see a priest, I hope it's on their conscience. because priests are essential healthcare workers, and when this happens again, they can wear all the same protective outfits as everybody else, and everything every other healthcare workers do, and they can be taking all precautions. But priests need to be there as part of that essential healthcare, and the bishops need to insist upon that.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. This interesting metaphor of battle that we have brought into the discussion, there's a time to fight, and then you reach the point where you realize the time has come to surrender. And there's St. Paul compares dying to childbirth. He talks about, I know some feminists just go screaming into the night when this is mentioned, but he talks about how women actually are preparing through childbirth. And as someone who's gone through childbirth a number of times, I can honestly say it's a dress rehearsal for death. And there is a complete and utter letting go and surrender you must do for that child to be born. And people on the threshold of death, there's a similar thing that goes on. You're fighting and fighting and fighting to stay alive. And then you come to that point where you realize you're being beckoned to surrender and let go. And this is a discernment process. This is this is not easily told from the outside what you should and should not be doing. But in this book, and I've heard of other cases of this, where these men have out of obedience said yes to their deaths, or out of obedience waited, or whatever. I've seen this happen.
Right. I like it when they say, when the abbot says, "Don't die till I come back."
Right.
And so the monk says, "Okay, I'll hang on there until you get back here."
A priest we know many, many, many years ago, when he was near death and he was fighting. You fight to live. That's your instinct, of course. And if we didn't have that self-preservation instinct, we wouldn't live for very long. And he was fighting and fighting, and his superior, who was a much younger man and was very almost fearful of doing the wrong thing, he said, "Father, I see that you're struggling. I'm going to make it easy for you. Out of obedience to me, say yes to God and let go." And the man died right then. And so there's this mystery, right? There's this mystery of God beckoning, our wills cooperating. And so what you started out with, Father, at the beginning, the most important, or maybe it was you, Joseph, the most important act of earthly existence is to die.
Yeah.
When we become Christians, we are baptized into the death of Christ. We start dying now.
Right.
And we go through lots of rehearsals and lots of opportunities to train for this moment. And that's why these monks are such an example, because they're training in such a much more intense way. Or maybe I should say, I wouldn't say their training is any more intense than childbirth, okay? But they're self-consciously preparing for this. And I think what's happened in modern society is we've lost that consciousness. Why are we here? Where are we going? How are we going to get there? And how are these experiences of infirmity and ultimately death, are we actually going to the Lord?
Yeah, I think the key lesson we learned from this book, consciousness is absolutely correct. But the thing about the religious life in the good orders is they're focused on that greatest and most important act of life, which is death, at all times. Those four last things are always at the forefront of their daily life and their meditation. So there's so much in this book, so much more we could discuss, Father, but we're running out of time here. So shall I just give the reading assignment for next week?
Well, just a couple of quick things on that as a preview to future things. I think the way the death is handled among us, which we'll see in future chapters, with the candles and the vigils and the prayers and so on. I mean, it really gives a beautiful image of how we as Christians should help others who are dying and want to be helped ourselves when we're dying. But I don't want to leave this chapter without saying one thing or asking you about one thing. It's kind of surprising, even shocking, that the first person they talk about here is a brother Irenee who commits suicide. And you're thinking, wait a minute, we're in a monastery, right? How does that fit into the picture? I mean, at the very least, it shows us that you enter a monastery, you don't leave all your human discouragements and difficulties and problems. But I found that rather surprising.
I did, but I also found it paradoxical as well as perplexing, and a bit like a Graham Greene novel of a priest, a monk committing suicide. But on page 45, his suicide note is sorry, I am suffering too much, I am going. All right, so that's that. But then he composed a prayer to God before giving up his life to despair. Lord, you will forgive me. I cannot go on. I cannot stay. I know that I am going to you. Now, my question would be that brother who's about to commit suicide is not suffering from despair, which is the absence of hope. If anything, if we want to ascribe a sin to him, and I don't really want to sit in judgment upon someone who's died, his sin is presumption. I can take my own life and I'm still going to you because you love me. All right, but certainly that suicidal soul is not despairing. He might be presumptuous.
Right. Well, that word despair, you're right, Joseph. It ultimately means the lack of hope in God, but sometimes it means also just a giving up of being healed in the here and now. He obviously believed in God and believed that God would be merciful. So
yeah, I do think we have to define our terms properly. Despair is the absence of hope. Surrender is giving up, and there can be a good surrender. There can't be a good despair.
Right. Well, it's interesting that suicide is kind of a counterfeit surrender, right? But it often is in response to giving up hope in the temporal sense of the word, of ever being better, of ever being released from this pain. People in this kind of mental illness, these are not rational actions, and so you're right. It's wise not to judge and commend them to God, but the impact that has on a community or a family that has had a member commit suicide. And on page 47, the author says the abbey had to rebuild its faith. The monks had no choice but to accept the humiliation of a scathing denial. Only prayer remained for moving forward. And I think that's often what people who know people who've committed suicide, that's actually the place where they end up. They can't explain it. They can't justify it. They can only pray.
And you're right, Vivian. The reason we shouldn't judge is because we don't know to what extent the soul that makes that choice was sane. We can't make that judgment. God makes that judgment.
Right. I love that line from the Cure of Ars, when the widow goes to him and worries that her husband who'd committed suicide was damned. And Father Vianney says, "Madam, between the precipice and the rocks, he repented."
That's great. Okay, so Joseph, what are we going to cover next week?
Well, if we can read before next week's session, chapters 3, 4, and 5.
3, 4, and 5. Solem, Setfon, and Citeaux. Very good. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next week. God bless you all.